I think a lot of people still sort of are very curious about my being a poet and an engineer, and they still kind of look at me like a one-eyed monster, like sort of very curious about what that really means. And as careers, they're totally sort of different, obviously. And I've had sort of my journey and sort of frustrations and sort of had to figure out where I lie between these two things. I guess I should clarify that I don't hate it. I love engineering. I've always been a left brain, right brain kind of person. So I wasn't, a lot of people tend to think that I studied engineering against my will and then discovered poetry and became a poet. And I kind of mess with them and tell them, well, yeah, I wanted to go into poetry because there was so much money, so much more money than in engineering, but I decided to stay in engineering. But the truth is that that sort of they just were separate worlds for many years. One poet, engineer by day, poet by night. And when I was in poetry circles, I was a poet who also earned a living as an engineer. And when I was an engineer, I was an engineer who also did poetry. And actually, many engineers used to go to my poetry readings or whatnot. So I've always found, you know, the only thing I really wanted to be an architect is actually what I wanted to do since I was a kid. And the plan was to get a degree in engineering and structural engineering and then go on to a master's in architecture. Somewhere along the line, I became a poet. And I never really understood the intersection of them, and I never really understood how important both of them were until I stopped engineering for a while. I took a hiatus and started teaching creative writing. And I realized that my balance was off, that I needed my left brain to be very busy and I needed my right brain to be very busy. And I started taking out, approaching the poem in a much more left brain way and very analytical and very stoic, and started formulating poems instead of just letting them flow and sort of letting them create. Not that poetry also in language involves a lot of left brain, because it does, especially at the editing stages. And I think my poetry suffered because of that. And so eventually I went back to engineering and found a great happy medium. I'd exhaust my left brain at work and then come home and be completely creative, and still would use my right brain in engineering, because you do need to design and you do need to sort of be creative in certain aspects, and use my left brain in my editing and in my revisions of my poems. But as careers, they still hadn't come together. And it was about 15, no, not 15, I guess maybe 10 years ago, I started specializing in my field in community development and city planning and town planning, town revitalization projects. And there was this great intersection. I realized that part of what drove my engineering was this idea of creating space and home, and of course of poet and community and poetry. My poetry and all my writing really is obsessed about the meanings of home, of place, of community, of belonging. And so, you know, I would come into a community and sort of sit around in a room with 300 people and ask them, what is home? And what does that mean to you? And translate that into brick and mortar. And it was interesting to me that sort of what I did as an engineer was a physical manifestation of that obsession of home, or the physical landscape, and my poetry was the psychological or the emotional landscape, and the connection between those two things. That everything that happens to us happens in place. It happens in 3 dimensions, and that not only was I sort of aware of that, but I was creating that sense of home for people together, obviously with their sense and their vision of what home meant. And so now I'm fascinated, I've become fascinated by both, and sort of they've found a home for each other. There's been a wonderful intersection in that way. And I've always called myself, it's interesting because I got my engineering license the same year I got my master's in fine arts and creative writing. And so I got my engineering license and my poetic license in the same year. But when you get your license, you get to put PE after your name, professional engineer, except in my office, my nameplate said Richard Blanco, PE, poet, engineer.